This 2,000-year-old coin just decoded for us the greatest mystery of the book of Revelation. I'm talking about Mystery Babylon, or Babylon the Great, one of the most debated characters in Bible prophecy. And believe it or not, this little piece of Roman history just decoded her identity for us. What you're about to see will blow your mind. But before we dive into the Bible, let's talk about the coin. It's known as the Vespasian coin. It was a Roman coin minted in the latter half of the 1st century AD by, you guessed it, Emperor Vespasian, who ruled from about 69 to 79 AD. And it was in the latter half of his tenure, late 70s AD, that he minted this coin. And like most Roman coins of higher quality, it was circulated for quite a long time. You know, I'm always blown away when I take a quarter out of my pocket and I see it's from 1975. But yet Roman coins of higher quality, it was not uncommon for them to be circulated for a century, 2 centuries. And in this case, the Vespasian coin was around from about the late 70s AD till about the end of the 2nd century, almost 200 AD. And most notably, it was around in the life of the apostles. Most of them, unfortunately, had been martyred by this time, by the mid-70s AD, but a few of them did remain, and especially the author of this book of Revelation, the Apostle John. He would have been very familiar with this coin, which is probably why he references it, or references the material on it. Let's look at what the book of Revelation has to say.
So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus.
All right, so we have this woman. She's decked out in gaudy, rich clothes. She's got precious stones all over. And she's riding this 7-headed, 10-horned beast with a cup of gold in her hand. And she's a bad guy, if you can't already tell. It's written over her forehead, the mother of prostitutes, which kind of gives that away. And worst of all, she is said to be responsible for the martyrdom of God's people. Okay, well, I saw the coin, but I don't see anything that matches that description. But the key here is in the interpretation John gives us of the vision.
And here is the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits.
All right, so let's take a look at the coin. We have a woman sitting on exactly 7 hills, and note the inscription at the bottom. Roma. I don't think we're talking tomatoes here, guys. Roma. Who's Roma? You guessed it. Rome. The city of Rome. In fact, verse 18 makes it clear.
The woman which you saw is that great city that reigns over the kings of the earth.
So the identity of this woman, this mystery Babylon the Great, is the city of Rome. Okay, but how is she Rome? In what sense? Well, the rest of the imagery bears our attention here. First of all, she's riding this large 7-headed, 10-horned beast. And it's important to note that throughout Bible prophecy, beast refers to governmental powers or geopolitical powers and kingdoms. Most notably, Daniel chapter 7, where he has the great vision of beasts coming out of the sea, representing successive kingdoms that would come after him. The first one, pictured here by this lion, refers to Babylon, the kingdom that was currently in power at his time. But then a great bear would rise out of the sea, this big beast signified as a bear. And this would be the Medo-Persian Empire, which overcame Babylon. And then, of course, we have Greece, signified by the 4-headed leopard, which is interesting because the Greek Empire would then split off into 4 sections representing the generals of Alexander the Great, and that did happen in history. And finally, we have this miscellaneous beast that stomps over everything, crushes everything in the prophecy, and has iron teeth. And this is associated with Rome. The iron teeth may signify their extensive work with iron or their powerful rule. It's been debated, but generally agreed upon, this is talking about Rome. But notice, in Daniel's vision, Rome is this great, terrible beast. And certainly in John's time of writing, that would be said about the Roman Empire, which was in full swing and full geopolitical power at that time. But in his prophecy in Revelation, Rome's not the beast, it's a woman. But specifically, a woman who's riding the beast. And if you're riding something like an animal, what are you trying to do to it? Steer, control, and influence it. And this aspect is key in understanding the identity of the woman as it develops here. Okay, so Rome was this ancient superpower that died out like what, 1,000+ years ago? What does that have to do with a future apocalyptic event? Well, remember, Christianity was instated as the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century under Constantine. And even as Rome died as an empire, the Roman Catholic institution only grew in its wealth and its political power, eventually becoming the Holy Roman Empire, where we had the merging of secular governmental power with supreme religious authority under papal control. And this isn't just over the papal states of Italy, but even over the kings of the earth. The popes would rule them as vicars of Christ. So as before, when you had the king as the highest authority in the land, well, now you had one above him. You had the pope, who had this religious authority, and not just over one kingdom, over multiple kingdoms all throughout the earth. This allowed the popes to set up kings, depose kings, put entire nations under interdiction. The level of authority was unheard of, especially in this religious sense. So Rome went from being the beast to the woman riding the beast. Or as verse 18 puts it, the woman is that city reigning over the kings of the earth. And now she has this religious identity. And here in John's prophecy, we have her with mother of harlots written on her forehead. It's interesting that it's on her forehead. That's likely a reference to the Old Testament concept of the whore's forehead, which was a term for somebody who was unashamed in their evil doings, and often described Israel this way in their departure as a nation from God. But here, she wears it on her forehead, she's unashamed, and she's got this cup full of abominations and fornication. It should be noted that these two words are common throughout Old Testament prophecy, speaking of spiritual fornication and spiritual idolatry over physical corruption. It's often used of Israel, just as the whore's forehead concept was, to describe their departure from God, sometimes even in the same verse. And here in the book of Revelation, she's shown sharing this cup of abominations and fornication with the kings of the earth. They're drunk on the wine of her fornication, it says, off of the spiritual adulteries and departure from God that she's doling out to them. And drawing back on the harlot imagery, she's someone who's supposed to be representing God, but instead does the opposite and departs from him. The last thing to note about her spiritual identity here is the colors that she's wearing. Verse 4 tells us she's arrayed in scarlet and purple, or red and purple. That's pretty interesting, because in the Roman Catholic institution, below the Pope, you've got the cardinals and the bishops, who apparently are the succession of the 11 apostles other than Peter, which the Pope represents. And can you guess what the primary colors are of the cardinals and the bishops? Yep, scarlet or red for the cardinals, and the bishops are purple. Am I reaching here? So the woman isn't just a spiritual harlot, she's also a wealthy one. And it's hard to quantify the vast wealth that the Roman Catholic Church possesses in real estate, in huge investment portfolios, fine art. But it's accumulated this wealth over generations and generations, a millennium plus time to accumulate all that wealth for itself. But it doesn't just make itself rich, it's also made rich the merchants of the earth in its extensive pilgrimage economy, monastery trade, and the building of huge cathedrals and religious structures throughout the world, making tradesmen and masons and architects rich. And more. And even if in its mission work, where ships need to be built and goods need to be brought and supplied, they have a long history of making the merchants of the world rich. And what's interesting about that is in chapter 18, where you have essentially the funeral of the woman, those who bewail her the most, her greatest mourners, are the merchants of the earth. Because the woman's no longer there to keep them busy and give them work and make them rich. The way the Catholic Church has fulfilled this aspect of the prophecy throughout history is kind of hard to replicate. All right, so lastly, she's not just a spiritual harlot or a rich one, she's also a violent one, as her imagery here in Revelation 17 caps off with her being responsible for the blood and the martyrdom of God's people. Now, the standard apologetic used by Rome here is that these great persecution of Christians occurred more in the pre-Christian era of the Roman Empire. And they are correct in the sense that this persecution was extensive, with numbers calculated anywhere from 10,000 to 100,000 Christians being martyred under that system. But what they fail to mention is that after the death of the beast and the rise of the woman, the persecution only got worse. And we're not just talking persecution of heretics and random people that weren't really Christian. We're talking Trinitarian Christians with largely the same beliefs, especially when it came to theology. Only real difference being in disagreement with papal authority and with ecclesiastical matters of church practice. This would include groups like the Donatites, the Waldensians, the Hussites, and even the Protestants. And the number of martyrs in this category, as the woman, goes as high as 800,000. Conservative estimates around 200,000 to 400,000. But at the very least, twice, if not triple or quadruple, what the Roman emperors of old, pre-Christian, did in their Christian persecutions. The next apology often given by Rome is that it wasn't the church that carried out the martyrdom. In fact, it was the civil magistrates that were put in charge of that activity. But, if you'll remember, Christ was crucified by the Romans. And when he was brought before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, he told him that he who handed me over to you has the greater sin, referring to the Jewish religious authorities that had condemned him, and claiming that they, the ones who handed him over, had the ultimate responsibility for his martyrdom. The third apology from Rome on this matter is regarding their own martyrdom and persecution throughout history. And it's true, Rome has faced persecution, has faced martyrdom at different times, but notice what the fate of the woman is in Revelation 17.
And the 10 horns which you saw on the beast, these will hate the harlot and make her desolate and naked, eat her flesh and burn her with fire.
So at the end of it all, this beast that the woman has been riding and controlling and influencing bucks her off his back and eats her. And this is something that's already happened throughout history. Think of the French Revolution, the Spanish Civil War, Nazi Germany, the Protestants, kingdoms and groups of people that the church used to influence greatly or rule over, which was true in all of the cases just mentioned. Which brings us to a critical juncture in the identity of the woman. Rome will argue that the persecution and martyrdom during the Protestant Reformation was often both-sided. We martyred them, they martyred us, it was a crazy time. And they're 100% right about that. In fact, all of the check marks made between Rome and the woman could be said to be true of the Protestant church. Protestants had a major influence over kings and authorities, they amassed great wealth, and they have also been responsible for the martyrdom of God's people. Remember, Luther didn't want to leave the church. He wanted to reform it, hence the Reformation. But he was excommunicated and forced to leave. And along with Calvin and Zwingli and many of the progeny that came after them in this Protestant Reformation, continued in many of the sins of Rome, which could then fairly lump them into the identity of the woman, especially since they draw their lineage back to that same city on 7 hills. All right, so now we're all confused. Who is the harlot? Is it the Protestants or the Catholics? And in the end time, when this all culminates, will this harlot rise up out of Rome or out of Geneva or Germany or the United Kingdom? And the answer is, we don't know. And that's because the nature of prophecy is that we won't know everything until it actually happens. But it's key to understand that the nature of biblical prophecy, beyond that fact, is that it is often a progressive reality. Some call it dual fulfillment or manifold fulfillment, but prophecy often doesn't occur in a vacuum, but happens progressively throughout time with multiple fulfillments. This is seen many times throughout Scripture, like the virgin birth, the gift of tongues, the messianic blessing on Solomon or Messiah, probably both, the destruction of the temple and the events of the Olivet Discourse. And even here with this particular issue, the same author of Revelation writes in chapter 2 of his epistle, his first epistle, "You have heard that Antichrist is coming. So now many Antichrists have already come." So there's a later ultimate fulfillment of this character, the Antichrist, yet many have already come in the same spirit, in the same idea, and will come until the culmination of that event. And simply here, in all of the descriptions of the woman, Rome has fit the bill in ways hard to replicate throughout the record of history. And we can say with great surety that even if she isn't the ultimate fulfillment of it, she is it and has been it throughout history. All right, so why does all this matter? Well, in Revelation 18, in the culmination of this prophecy of the woman, of Babylon the Great, God calls out to his people. Revelation 18, 4-5 says,
And I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins and lest you receive of her plagues.
Notice the command isn't geographical here, like Lot, who needed to flee the city because God was just about to destroy Sodom. Although that element could be at play here, reading the events of the prophecy, but the call is spiritual in nature. Be not partaker of her sins. Don't drink from the cup of abominations on which the kings of the earth have become drunk, full of spiritual infidelity and departure from God. be it in doctrines like the too close for comfort veneration of Mary, or praying to dead saints who are alive to Christ, but dead to us, or asleep, as Paul puts it, and people we shouldn't be trying to contact. The historical sale of indulgences, purgatory, and the list goes on. Subject matter for a list of different videos. And I do personally believe that many Catholics are true believers. And I can't say that about every so-called branch of Christianity out there. But they're in a system that, whether you agree with it or not, checks all the boxes of this description of this great spiritual harlot that reigns over the kings of the earth. And that alone should drive one to the testimony and study of the scriptures and in prayer to God. But these people face a unique problem, because according to Rome, they are the historical Christian church. I mean, if I left there, where would I go? Especially if you're telling me that Rome's the harlot, Protestants are the harlot, or potentially included in that. What, do I start my own church? Well, this claim that Rome is the historical embodiment of Christ's church is false. They're certainly historical, but the reality is there have always been small pockets, communities, and assemblies of Christian believers that have met together in simplicity, often under persecution, traced all the way back to the first century and the lives of the apostles. A great book on this is The Pilgrim Church by E.H. Broadbent, which documents many of these assemblies throughout history that haven't been lost. Which brings us to our last important point. God's people have always consisted of a remnant. Elijah the prophet called out to God and said, "I'm the last of those who worship you." And God said, "Not so fast. I got 5,000 others who haven't bowed the knee to Baal." And this 5,000 was out of the entire nation of those who supposedly represented God's people. In Isaiah chapter 1, God declares his disgust with the state of the Jewish religion at that time, saying, "Your sacrifices and oblations are disgusting to me. Your new moons and Sabbaths my soul hates. They are a trouble to me. I'm weary to bear them." But these are all things God commanded them to do. Why would this be bad? Well, he says in a later chapter, "These people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me." And back in chapter 1, he says, "If God had not left us but a remnant, we would have been like Sodom and become like Gomorrah." And we see this extended even into the first century in the life of Christ. His major complaint against the Jewish religious authorities was that their honor was with their lips, but in their heart they were departed from God. Quoting that verse from Isaiah, and he tacks onto it saying, "They teach as doctrine the commandments of men." Well, that was the Old Testament system. Christ brought the church. It's totally different now, right? Well, Christ says, "When the Son of Man returns, will there be faith on the earth? Broad is the way that leads to destruction, and there are many that go in by it, but narrow is the way that leads to life, and there are few that find it." And here in Revelation 18, God's call is for all of those to come out of the great woman, the great spiritual harlot, and to consider their stance with him and that he is the only one that can save them. I hope this was helpful. Thanks for watching.